Hey there. If you've been enjoying the Unchained Binge Podcast, you should know that this podcast, like everything else we do here at the Escape Collective, is member funded. That means we're funded by, well, you, if you're already a member. And if you're not, we hope you'll think about becoming one. You can head on over to escapecollective.com/join to sign up and become part of a pretty awesome community. It's a community that supports this podcast and the others on the Escape Collective Podcast Network, as well as everything that we write about bikes and more over on the escapecollective.com website. It's also a community with a very active Discord channel where we sometimes do live recordings of podcasts, by the way. In other words, there are lots of reasons to sign up. Our monthly memberships start at $11.99 USD, or you can save 30% by signing up annually. We'd love to have you as a member. And again, you can head over to escapecollective.com/join to find out more and sign up.
This is the Unchained Binge Podcast. I'm Kaylee Fretz, and we're going to go deep on Netflix's new Tour de France docuseries in this podcast. In today's episode, first episode, we have a tear-jerking win from a farmer's son, a bit of image polishing for two of the more controversial managers in the sport, a redemptive comeback win, and yes, some manufactured drama on a bridge. Let's get into it. Joining me today, we've got a rock star group of reporters with the Escape Collective. I'm going to start off with Kit Nicholson. Kit, you're kind of our movie buff, TV buff. Brought you in because, well, this is a TV show, and we want your insight into how such things are made.
Yeah, well, I hope I can bring some insight for that then. Bit of pressure.
A little bit of pressure. Also joining, Johnny Long. How are you, Johnny?
Good, thanks, Kaylee.
And Abby Mickey. Welcome, Abby.
Hello.
Let's kick off with first impressions. So we've just watched the first episode of Unchained. And just to be clear, with the audience out there, the way that we're picturing this happening is basically you watch an episode, you listen to a podcast. You watch an episode, you listen to a podcast. You don't have to do it that way, but that's kind of the way that we're producing these things. We watch an episode, we're going to go deep on episode 1. So at the end of episode 1, or let's say even halfway through episode 1, what were you all feeling about this highly touted docuseries? I mean, the context here is that we've kind of been promised, based off of the premise of Drive to Survive and Formula One and the massive growth over there, we've been kind of promised the same thing, that this would pull in a whole new audience to professional cycling, that we'd have all these new fans that we could talk to. Do you think that this is going to, after only one episode, you think we're there? What were your first impressions?
It was very much for non-fans, I felt, the first episode. But also, I guess my major takeaway from the first episode was they showed a lot of crashes. And I didn't love that. But it's also, if you kind of remove yourself from being, a fan of the sport for many, many years, if you're brand new to the sport, crashes are such a huge part. And so while I didn't like to see them, especially Jakobsen's crash, like over and over and over and over, it was definitely, it was unpleasant, but I think it was needed to kind of set the stage and the stakes. So my first impression was I never want to see that crash from Jakobsen ever again. I fear that I will see it many more times in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to agree with that.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, because we obviously watch a lot of cycling, we're used to the crashes in terms of we don't need to see them and pore over them. But if you're just getting introduced to the sport, it sort of lets you know where the stakes are at, and it gives you an understanding of what the riders go through, and what it means to like go into a corner or come out of a corner at whatever kilometers an hour. I think that really helps to explain what bike racing is.
Yeah, there was heavy use of onboard cameras in episode 1, and I think that was actually quite effective. I think that unless you've ever been in a peloton, there's no real way of understanding how chaotic and dangerous that can feel. from just like a helicopter shot, which is generally, you know, the big sort of wide vista helicopter shot is generally what we get during the Tour de France. I thought those were very effective shots at like you say, Johnny, kind of like setting the stakes and determining and helping people determine like what could go wrong when things do go wrong.
Yeah, that was probably one of my major, I don't know, impressions of the first episode was it was quite fast paced. From the beginning, from the very start, even in the quickfire language that was used, and then of course we transition into a sprint masterclass or a sprint tutorial, whichever way you want to look at it. I think, well, there's also a mirror to be found in Drive to Survive, first episode of which does also feature a lot of crashes, and I did my homework and watched some last night, so. Yeah, it seems to be a theme that they like, these producers, a bit of crashing.
What I feel could have been really useful was like a 30-second like explainer with like loads of graphics on exactly how bike racing and the Tour de France works. Like I kind of vaguely remember that in Drive to Survive at some point, but just explaining like, okay, this is how you win the Tour de France, and like the real basic stuff that if it's only 30 seconds, and if you've ever watched the race before, then it's fine, you can sit through that. But the explanations of how everything worked and with the teams and the domestiques working for the leaders was sort of communicated to the audience via, unless you spoke French, via the subtitles of a French speaker, which I feel, unless you're really paying attention, if you miss that, then it's just gone, and maybe then you're guessing how it all works for the rest of the episode.
Yeah, it was heavily French influenced, and we kind of knew that was going to be the case. We'd heard that, in fact, that ASO, the owner of the Tour de France, had kind of not demanded, but requested that there was quite a bit of French influence. And you know, we spent a bunch of time, we don't want to spend too much time on this right now, but we spent a bunch of time prior to this coming out wondering who was going to be the Will Buxton person in this series, right? Will Buxton in Drive to Survive, he's the one that's like, he says things like, to win, you must be the first car across the finish line. Like things like that. And, but you know, like very basic explanations.
Take it day by day.
Yeah, I can take it day by day. Who was going to be that person for this series, and we all thought it would be Orla Chenouille, and she does feature, but Steve Chanel, who is on French Eurosport and does quite a bit of French commentary and is a former professional, but is speaking French, he's the one that ends up doing more of that explanation. I do wonder whether that would have been a helpful thing, Johnny. I also wonder whether they're going to pepper that in throughout subsequent episodes, because what it felt like to me, what this entire episode felt like to me, was like they were absolutely terrified of a slow moment dropping people, right? Like every single second of it felt like a 40-minute trailer to me. Like it would slow down in a couple very key places, but they were very emotional moments. They weren't like you're not going to turn it off in the slow-mo bits where Yves Lampert is like finding out that he just won the yellow jersey, right? You're not going to lose people there. But that's the only time it slowed down, kind of for most of the episode.
I have a counterpoint to that, Kaylee, in that I think because of it being so high paced, and you get this quite often in film reviews, if a film, particularly it seems in superhero movies or even movie musicals, you get a kind of monorail emotion all the way through. There's no fluctuation at all. And I found that to be the case, as you've said, for much of the episode. But then one of my favourite moments, for a couple of reasons, was when we saw Fabio Jakobsen cleaning his bike, which was both a humanising moment and a slowdown, and I don't think there was any soundtrack. And it was just before we then started to build again towards the climax. And that was a very crafty, you know, that was the producers or the directors had worked through the episode and gone, we need to be able to ramp everybody back up for the finale when Jakobsen wins the stage. And that was in that moment when he's cleaning his bike. And it also serves to make him human. And it's not, you know, we haven't seen a mechanic's truck yet. Well, except for with Hugs. You know, we haven't seen that sort of side of it, which I hope we'll see. But yeah, that moment I felt was an important part in the arc of the episode. And it was slow.
Do you think the mechanic who cleans Fabio Jakobsen's bike 200 days out of 365 days a year is sitting there like, God damn it! Like that was my one moment. But not. I think it's important to not just keep on comparing to Drive to Survive. But when that bike washer moment happened, my first thought was you did not see any of the Formula One drivers at any point like cleaning their cars, and it sort of serves. I think that was a great way to display like the differences with cycling with other professional sports. A fun fact for you as well, the first day by day of the episode and of the series was 9 minutes 49 seconds in. So it must have been a contractual obligation to get that common, like the most common phrase that bike racers say within the 10-minute mark.
I started keeping a tally. I thought there was going to be another one. I've got a little note at the bottom of my page with a little strike, but I think it was the only one in that episode.
I think so, yeah.
Sadly. I'll keep it going.
If it was women's cycling, we'd have at least 10 from strength to strengths in the first episode.
The other one which we had to wait until the end of the episode, but I'll just jump forward since we're talking about what's the word for them again? When you say when Fraser said too much, like cliche. Thank you, Kit. Jeez. Was we had to wait to the end of the episode for you don't win the tour here, but you can certainly lose it.
Yeah. But that's coming next.
Oh yeah, it was.
That's because we're about to get one of the coming episodes is going to be on the stage for Roubaix cobbles.
Oh yeah, but we at least got it, and we got to see it.
We did get it in the first episode. So this first episode, I mean, hopefully if you listen to this, you've seen it, but it focuses on these early sprint stages and also the opening time trial. And so kind of our two storylines are with, at the time, was Deceuninck Quickstep and its manager, Patrick Lefevre, very old school Belgian guy. And then on the other side of the coin, we have EF Education, Easy Post, and their run at the opening time trial with Stefan Bissiger, right, who is a Swiss time trial specialist. And they went into that opening time trial thinking that it was their number one opportunity for a stage win of the entire race. And that drama felt a little bit manufactured to me in that, there's 20 stages after that, and they have a pretty decent bike racing team. But they sort of played that up, and they did that mostly with that team's manager, Jonathan Vaughters. Now, anybody sort of deep inside cycling is going to know those two names really, really well. If you are not deep inside cycling, you maybe don't. I thought it was interesting that they provided a bit of a spit polish for the reputation of both of those managers, right? They kind of allowed them to speak on their own terms, in their own words, and in fact, even allowed Jonathan Vaughters to take a bit of an elbow at his lifelong enemy, Lance Armstrong. Nemesis. Lance Armstrong. So you've got that side with JV, and then you've also got on the Patrick Lefevre side, Lefevre has said some misogynistic things in the past. That's an understatement. He said some things in the past that would that have led to people classifying him as a bit of a dinosaur. And that was kind of just papered over, and he was painted as this, kind of genius manager that was able to turn riders into stage winners. And frankly, like Yves Lampart winning that opening time trial was shocking for sure. But that to me was one of the big kind of highlights of this first episode, was those two managers kind of getting a bit of an easy pass and a bit of they were allowed to, like I said, like kind of tell their own stories there.
I feel like the Stephen Bissiger part was actually one of my favorite parts of the first episode. And I disagree, Kaylee. I don't think it was manufactured at all, because you win the first stage, you get the first yellow jersey. And that would have been EF's only chance at a yellow jersey in the race.
I was kind of talking about like the bit with JV in a boardroom saying that like if we don't win a stage, all the sponsors are going to go away.
Weird.
Yeah, we're all fired.
Yeah.
No. That was kind of weird. But I feel like the part where they showed, him in the wind tunnel, and they had Charlie Wegelius, the team DS, kind of talking about, when I saw him take the first corner, I knew. All of that stuff. I feel like
he was going to crash.
I knew he was going to crash. It was one of my favorite parts of the first episode, because it showed that there are a lot of riders in the peloton that deserve to win a stage of a Grand Tour like the Tour de France. But just because you deserve it doesn't mean that you're going to get that win. And Bissiger wouldn't have been the only rider in the peloton to put in that much work before the first TT just to lose it. I know Mess Peterson from Trek Segafredo also spent a ton of time in the wind tunnel, spent a ton of time on his CT bike, was just like totally set on winning that first time trial and didn't win it. And so I feel like seeing that part of that side of the sport and that side of the Tour de France in the very first episode was pretty powerful. And I think like it was really interesting not only seeing the two managers, but also seeing the way that they think, the way that they approach their teams. It was obviously a huge difference between the two. I will say, like, as someone who despises Patrick Lefevre, I'm not afraid to say it. I was really disappointed to see him get like a redemption edit. I was hoping to see him get the Christian Horner edit because I know nothing about F1, but I know that there are a few people in sport I hate more than Christian Horner, and I was really disappointed that Paddy Leff, he didn't get that villain edit.
I think that the decision to I mean I would agree with everything about Bissiger being a really good focus, partly to offset the Quick Step story, and very, I mean, it's quite convenient. I think I don't think it's particularly important, but it's convenient that they painted Quick Step. I think they might even have said the best team, or did they say the most winning team? But they also referred to Jumbo-Visma as the best team. Anyway, so that more or less the same thing, but I don't know, pick bones out of that. But yeah, so you had the most winning team versus the the lowest on the standings, the World Tour standings, and that was the first mention of relegation and points, then skated over and not explained. But still, you had that offset between EF and their desperation to get a win, and Quickstep being the ones who've got 47 wins at the Tour already, and they're going to get another one. It's just a matter of when. But it also had the context of crashing, with Bissiger crashing twice in his. It was it's a classic sort of finding a pattern retrospectively and it working perfectly, and it really did for this episode. The shame that it's a little sad maybe that EF kind of comes off as a failure because of the drama that you've mentioned, Kaylee, in the sense that this was their one chance and they're all out of a job if they don't win the first stage. Because we know that, spoiler alert, if you didn't watch the 2022 Tour de France, they win a stage in about a week's time. So we know that there's a very good chance we're going to see that. But after that Grand Départ, that they had a bloody good Grand Départ, which we'll get to, I'm sure. They just didn't win a stage, and it just kind of, they get painted as the failures opposite these massive winners in Quickstep.
I don't know how to deal with spoilers on this podcast because
no, I think spoilers don't. There's no such thing.
It's a year.
I mean, the race happened a year ago.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no such thing as spoilers within the race, but there's spoilers within the show.
Yeah, I haven't watched past. I haven't. Yeah,
like we won't. Yeah, we won't spoil the show, but we might spoil the race results, which happened a year ago.
Yeah,
so.
It's on you. It's on you if you didn't see the race.
I thought with the contrast between EF and Quickstep, and also like with the crashes, the crash reels and everything, I think it was also building up to the over dramatized moment of the episode, which was Yves Lampart's crash on the bridge, which they made a huge deal out of. But actually, like, he got back into the peloton with everyone else who crashed like a K later on the bridge still. So it was like not a big deal at all.
Yeah, and then let out the stage winner.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like part of the crashing was also to try to make that moment more dramatic, which for anyone who watched the race, they were like, wait, didn't he even if you didn't watch the race and you're watching him chase back on, they get back on before the bridge ends. So you're like,
which is still like a couple kilometers away from the finish, like a significant distance away from the finish. Yeah, I mean that bit certainly felt a bit manufactured. But if you will recall, like part of the reason I'm almost willing to give that a pass is we were all sitting there kind of hoping for the bridge to be a huge deal. I mean, remember this, it was in the lead up to the race last year. I don't know how many stories we wrote about it. Everyone else is writing stories about it. It's a big bridge with crosswinds. Crosswinds break up the peloton. That brings chaos. That brings crashes. Like, the whole kind of cycling world was kind of hoping for this to be a big deal, and then it ended up not being a big deal, and then Netflix just made it a big deal anyway.
Because the peloton keeps moving, it never stops.
And if you're not in it, you're dead, or something like that.
Yeah, that's the Mark Madeo quote.
If you're not in the peloton, if you're in the peloton, you're alive. If you're not in the peloton, you risk death.
You are facing death, and if new viewers, that's all you need to know what Mark Madeo is like, the boss of the biggest French team. Superb.
Returning really briefly to our managers here, so the Jonathan Vaughters Lance Armstrong bit was interesting to me.
Champion on that team, so it was a big deal. That's me with Lance. This is where my doping is at its absolute peak. All I was worried about was getting caught for doping the next day, and I couldn't sleep. And like with Lance, I don't think any of that was true. I think he slept like a baby.
The fact that they left it in there was interesting to me. The fact that he got to sort of like throw an elbow, essentially with no response, was interesting to me. What did you guys... It was not that long, but it was relevant in that it almost felt like Lance had to be mentioned somewhere in the first episode, right? And then they got that kind of out of the way.
It was more that I think because we've been building up to this for ages and waiting for it and like wondering how it's going to be angled and focused, that when that happened, I was thinking, is this going to be like a bit juicier and spicier than we thought? Because the immediate thought with one of these sports documentaries where they've had to get everyone on side is that inevitably it's going to be a softer version of the true reality of professional sport. So when I saw that, I was like, maybe we're going to actually get some huge quotes and huge insight. But then when you saw sort of Patrick Lefevre getting a free pass for a lifetime of quotes that age like milk, and then even like the inclusion of the fake Jonathan Vaughters text that popped up on the fake phone, like that is it? I can't remember which artist it is, but that music video where the person's text on their phone, but it's in an Excel spreadsheet. It was basically the remake of that, but in the Netflix. Yeah. And I was just like, why have they put that in?
It's like my personal bugbear in TV and film when somebody gets a text from their mum and it's the first text from that person they've ever received.
Yeah, exactly. But it was, I think, I mean, we'll have to see how the rest of the series goes. But if there's like, you only need to sprinkle a few of those like Vaughters, Lance things in there, and you don't have to go that deep into it, but just to give the viewer enough to sit there on the phone and then like search on Wikipedia more about it, because that's kind of what this is all for, is to introduce the fans in. But you just need a bit, like with Patrick Lefevre, I mean, it's because they had to get the teams to agree to be on the show. So you're never going to be, hey Patrick, we'd love to feature your team and do loads of great activation for your sponsors, but also can we talk about how, you say sexist stuff sometimes. It's not gonna happen, unfortunately.
How you liked a whole bunch of porn videos recently on Twitter, and we can all see it.
Exactly.
For example. Yeah. The Vaughters Lance bit for me felt like it might have a bit of an ulterior motive in that it got doping discussion out of the way for the entire series.
Yeah.
That was my thought as well.
So, like, basically they acknowledge cycling's history and past in the span of about 10 seconds, and then they allow Vaughters to basically shove it aside and say, we built this new fresh, clean team, and now the whole sport is better, and it's all the rest. And they don't. It's not really satisfying in terms of historical accuracy, for example, but it does allow the show to move on and potentially not have sort of like, well, wasn't this sport like crazy full of doping forever? And people just sort of wondering that question, and maybe kind of answers that for them, and they can just move on with the show.
Just a random fact about Netflix in the build up to this. I've just seen earlier today, they've now got the rights to the program, which is coming next week. So that film that they made, well, I suppose docudrama, it's not quite, but it's the movie about Armstrong and the famous line, particularly, I've never tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs. The one starring Ben Foster and Chris O'Dowd. And
yeah.
So I wonder if Netflix, I don't know, it's a bit much to suggest that they have only put a small amount in to to facilitate people watching that. But I'm sure that when the program lands next week, it will be in the Watch Now, or it will be the Auto Watch Next, so they get something else that people can, bounce off from the from this documentary.
Is this a French Netflix production, or like Netflix
It's
as a
a
whole?
mix.
Because well,
so it's Netflix, but like one of the production houses is French, the other one was, I think, British.
Yeah.
Depending on the team that they were following. But the people behind it is like the same sort of executive producers and things as Drive to Survive. So it's not overly French, but they had to, and sort of the production behind it. Netflix has said numerous times that sort of the politics involved in getting this series together was significantly more difficult than it was with F1. Because in F1, particularly back then, you just like went to Bernie Ecclestone and were like, hey, can we do a thing in your thing? And he's like, cool, thumbs up. And that's basically everyone has to listen to him. There's no equivalent in cycling. So they had to go to every single team. They had to go to ASO, the tour organizer. They had to go to France Television to get all the TV rights. Like they had to do all these. It was a much bigger, broader process than Drive to Survive was.
Just to go back very quickly to the papering over of cycling's past and whatever. The quote from Waters was that his team had changed the landscape of the sport, and it's like, while they are doing things differently and they've been great innovators for a very traditional sport, it's not what's it called? That's not how all the teams operate. It's not. You still have like very French teams, and you have teams where like very French teams that aren't like wearing Crocs and tie-dye, and then you also have teams that aren't signed up to like the movement for credible cycling, where they have different levels for what they consider oh god, I need to say this right, performance enhancing but legal products, I think is the way to say it. So there are different levels of teams who sign up to that and don't. And so you can't just say like we've changed, like the landscape is a big thing, thing.
I think his argument would be sort of back in the early days of that team, he will argue, and he's argued this to me before, that they instigated a cultural shift more than anything. And as he says in the show, like, we made this cool, right?
Made anti-doping cool, yeah.
We made anti-doping cool, and that might be a bit of a stretch, but there was a cultural shift happening around that time. It's around when the biopassport came in, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, that would be that's his argument expanded upon. I think it was shrunken so far for the purposes of this show. I think the real point is just that they managed to get doping out of the way in like 15 seconds, and frankly, that's impressive. Like and then they just moved on with the show, right? And I don't know if it will come back or not, and I kind of doubt it, because why? Other than we're gonna find out later whether Johnny makes an appearance.
Oh yeah,
angering Wout van Aert, asking about doping.
If I had to guess right now, no.
I'm gonna say no, but you never know.
We'll get into that later.
Although, if we want to use this as a segue for one of my geeky moments.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Something in episode 1 that I was focusing on, partly because my brother's a composer, is the music. And I would describe it as faintly, early Hans Zimmer-esque in places. On the bridge, for sure. It was obviously a very key moment for dramatizing what was happening. But also the first time that Wout van Aert appears, when he's being described as the nemesis of Jakobsen, he steps out of a bus and there's this moody theme, and he's in super slow-mo, and it's this kind of bad guy theme, which comes up again with slightly less emphasis, but we'll get there. Can't say yet because we haven't watched that episode. But yeah, so that entrance of Van Aert. And when we had slow motion already, but we went into super slow-mo. This guy is not to be messed with. And there was this kind of, almost Dark Knight, low blow. Yeah, there was a mood being created. Which is funny. Wout van Aert and his big grin when he brings it out I can't really see him as a bad guy very easily, but they do a pretty good job in this episode.
I think with JV, it's also worth mentioning, like, he knows exactly what he's doing.
Oh yeah.
Like the series dropped, and he the EF immediately released like a line of fan clothing. Like he knows what he's doing. His team almost folded in 2017, and he called on fans to crowdsource the team. Allegedly, it would have failed without the fan support, and then they found a title sponsor. So he like totally knows what he's doing in this whole thing. He's gonna play into this way more than other managers. Like he's gonna know exactly what this can get him more than Patrick Lefevre would ever fathom.
Well, did you notice they both, when they sat down to do their like floating heads interview, they both did the clapper, like the movie clapper thing, which is what the team principals do in Drive to Survive. So they both clearly watched it and been like, do I want to be more Christian Horner or Toto Wolff? And they're sort of both there like, we're the next big thing. We're getting invited to XYZ. But I thought that was funny.
And also like when they were at the race, like Vaughters in his pink suit and like Patrick Lefevre in his like t-shirt looking like pretty grimy in the bus. And
and the hat. It's hilarious. The hat. Yeah. It's the I'm on holiday hat, which is great.
Oh yeah, his little like fedora thing. The music was amazing though. Like I think that like I think they did a really good job of the music, and I'm excited to see what tone of music they assign to other teams that they have, because obviously they started the series with only 2 teams in this episode and like a brief wow moment, but we know from the press release about the show that there's more teams that are going to enter later on, and also from like the teasers and stuff. So I'm really curious like what kind of insanely Frenchified French music we're going to get for like Ben O'Connor.
Oh, bless him.
Oh, poor guy.
I do think some of the shots were amazing, and also when you've like already watched the actual Tour de France and you've been across it all on social media, it's rare to see new things. But I think that's the thing that was most interesting, is you saw some really amazing artistic shots, but then also just like ones off the beaten path, and not only the inside ones like inside the bus, which are always cool to see, but just like little bits at the side of the road, or just things that, I don't know, I can't remember a specific one, but just more the little moments that get lost in watching live coverage of a bike race.
Well, it's like when you see, it reminded me of the Gruber's shots, when they'd be taking corners through Denmark, and you'd have some family's picnic table in the foreground and the race going past in the background.
Do you think that it's just because there's a limited time and they've got to focus on the race that like this series didn't make enough, or this episode didn't make enough of Denmark? And we've seen that the next episode goes to the cobbles, so are we going to get any Denmark stuff?
We're not going to get back to Denmark. I'm confident of that, and I think that plays into what we've mentioned already about not explaining everything fully for the non-fans, because they never explained why the Grand. I mean, there was the word international, but I think Christophe Prudhomme said he called it a race of French importance, but also international. That's the only real mention you get of, hang on, but they're in Denmark. And then of course you get the yellow and green jersey. The yellow jersey explained, but the green jersey isn't, and the yellow jersey and the green jersey change hands inexplicably.
Yeah.
And then the reason that we don't get stage 3 is because Jaco Alula and Groenewegen aren't in this series. But it's not explained why that's not featured. And I understand why we didn't go back to Magnus Kort's solo breakaway and party through Denmark on stage 3, because to do that after Jakobsen's stage win would have been a bit of a mute. Yeah. Well, the way that they played it would have been a fairly mute ending to the episode, although I kept waiting for it because I thought that was one of the most brilliant parts of that Grand Départ. But yeah.
I feel like Denmark got the Tom Bombadil treatment. Like it would have been too it would have been too that's a niche reference, and
we'll come back to niche references.
He got the Tom Bombadil treatment because had they thrown the fact that the first 3 stages were in Denmark into the show, it would have been too confusing with the hype of how important this race is to France. So like Tom Bombadil gets the ring and like it doesn't affect him at all. The race starts in Denmark, but they're trying to be like French expects a victory. So it's not. It would have been too confusing.
Yeah. You just start complicating the narrative. I mean, it was a very simple narrative around 2 teams and just a very select number of riders. And to add much else to that would have been
I suppose
confusing.
one time we might get back to Denmark is at the very, very, very end when a Dane wins.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but still, you might have. Well, I would expect there to be some sort of trickling in. We got Morkov being really, really celebrated at the team presentation, but that was. I mean, if you didn't know, well, I imagine that could have been fairly well skated over because we know that Morkov is Danish, and if you are focusing, you can see his Danish bands from when he was national champion. But that's the only real kind of celebrating a Danish rider that you get, and we haven't heard that Vingegaard is Danish and that it started in Denmark. That hasn't propped up yet, so we might come back, but it would be a bit weird to bring it back now.
Especially when he was so emotional on the podium. Like, that was such a big moment, I feel, of the Grand Départ, is when he got up there and was just so overcome with the crowds, and it was also such a good Grand Départ. Like, sometimes they can be a bit so-so, but the Copenhagen one was amazing.
I think they're being very careful with the number of characters that they introduce in a given episode.
Yeah.
And keeping in mind that trying to keep track of all these skinny white boys would probably get a bit tricky at some point.
Yeah.
Is like,
It's a full-time job.
We didn't even. Yeah, it's our full-time job, and we still struggle. So I think that we haven't seen much of Jonas Vingegaard at all, right? We've seen him sort of like flit in and out, but his position as really a marquee is not entirely clear at the end of this first episode. We're going to take a brief break here. So what was missing? What was kind of key in the moment, with us covering the actual bike race, that just either didn't show up or showed up in a very small way? What was missing?
I'd like to come at this by saying what was additional that had no real bearing on the race in a way, in that the big debate early in the Quick-Step storyline was between Jakobsen and Alaphilippe, which doesn't sound like a decision that you have to make, really, because they're not the same rider. And Alaphilippe, he comes across as a bit of a child in the episode, but at the same time really ready to go. He has that comment, is it just this descent and then we're back at the apartment? No, we've got another climb to go. Oh, just another climb then, or something like that. But still, we all wanted Alaphilippe to be there, I think. But the big point though is that there was absolutely no mention of Cav at all, and it took until just a few days before the Tour de France before we knew that Cav, 4-time stage winner the year before, and record equaling of all time, he didn't feature in even one breath.
I feel like that's when the Frenchness comes in, because the French who are watching this in France, who are not, actually I saw on Twitter, it was JV who said you should watch it with subtitles and not with the English dub over, because it's like, I found that super frustrating the whole episode. It was terrible. But the Frenchness comes in because it's Alaphilippe. Like, he's like the French baby. He's the world champion. He's huge in France. And like, to mention Cav was very much like a cycling fan would have appreciated that more, but the French want Alaphilippe in there in some form, and the only way to mention him was in the very first episode, in the very first like 10 minutes. And so like for us, the huge drama leading up to the race was, are they going to bring Cav? And that was a conversation that we were having from like, I don't know, August 2021. was like, are they going to bring Cav to the Tour next year to try to get that final win and beat the record and have the most Tour wins of all time? And for us, that was massive, but for the French fans, they don't care.
Did you notice though? I remember this at the time, and then you can actually see it in the episode. Is when the Quick-Step team are on having the team presentation, there is loads of footage and photos of Cav in the green jersey behind them, and so I mean they must have just made it. They have to make those things so far in advance, so they just gambled and were like, yeah, green jersey, whatever. But they could have done that with Alaphilippe, right? They could have still chosen that from the year before, and he was still in the World Champions jersey then. Yeah. But they went with the Cav thing. So that was weird as well, that it was more, you could feel it more at the race when that was the big story leading up to it. And then they had this whole thing about Cav and then introduced a team without Cav. So it would have made sense to at least mention that a bit, but it comes back to the sort of control of the narrative thing, right?
I wonder if there's something in the fact that Cav has his own documentary coming up. If there might have been some sort of contract arrangement.
Yeah, maybe.
Some sort of debate over ownership of certain images.
Yeah.
Who knows? We won't be able to answer that until we see that series or film or whatever it's going to be. I think that's this summer. I don't know.
Yeah, mid-August.
They'll bring it out. They'll bring it out when Jakobsen wins a stage, and they'll try and kind of.
You could have had just Patrick Lefevre like drawing a picture of Cavendish on like a napkin and then like creasing it to make him talk or something if they couldn't have had any of the rights, you know, just gone really, just showcased another one of Patrick's many talents.
What else is missing beyond sort of the Cav storyline that we all followed so closely and then just didn't show up at all? What else was what else is missing?
We've already mentioned Court, haven't we?
Yeah, Danish things. I mean, yeah, they won a stage later. Court spent a bunch of time in a solo breakaway.
We had a lot of explanation.
Second and third stages.
Yeah,
He was
second
off
and
the front.
first. Yeah.
Yeah, to get the
Second,
polka
third,
dot
third.
jersey, wasn't it?
Yeah, so
he-
that's the
yeah.
thing, is we had a big sprint tutorial in this episode, but we had absolutely no... I mean, we didn't ever see the breakaway. We saw the peloton a lot in stage 2. We never saw the breakaway. So I don't know. I realised that maybe it's a little bit complicated to try and explain. You know, why do these 4 guys want to go up the road, and then why does that mean that the peloton gets a day off or whatever?
I think we'll get that when there are like breakaway victories in the later episodes, because I guess with a
Fair
time
enough.
trial and a sprint, then that's 2 very easy ways to be like, oh, here's who won, and then you're like, later on, you know, you'll have Chanel being like, sometimes someone just rolls away up the road and they just win it.
I don't think the producers care how bike racing works, and I don't think they care to explain how bike racing works to this audience. I think that the only thing they really care about, and we'll see whether this is borne out in subsequent episodes, but this is my gut after episode 1. I think the only thing they really care about is sort of human condition, highs and lows, and human on human controversy. So, you know, so the battle between 2 individual riders, or as in the case of episode 1, where we have this sort of like real high for Jakobsen and Yves Lampert and real low for Bissiger. I think that's all they're looking for is what happens to these individual athletes, and then they tell the context around it, and that part can be interesting. But I fundamentally, like, I don't know if they will. I don't know if we'll ever get in 8 episodes like anything on the polka dot jersey, which is a big, massive, important thing in the Tour de France, and riders spend their entire career trying to get this jersey and win this jersey. And I would wager that they just ignore it unless they decide that somebody in it has a compelling enough storyline to dedicate a piece of an episode to. I don't think the actual like underlying structure of the bike race is actually really all that relevant to what they're putting together, which is why it's so frustrating for us, I think, in some ways.
But if I'm a first time watcher, like I was to the Drive to Survive, I mean, it's a little bit different because that is cars getting across the finish line. But if I was and somebody mentioned on our Discord that they'd watched it with their wife who doesn't follow cycling, and they were so confused by the yellow jersey and why 1 minute Lampert was in it, and then Van Aert's in it, and then he's in the green jersey. And I think if we get an image of anybody in the polka dot jersey, that's when a newcomer, you know, you're not going to get through 8 episodes, I don't think, if you don't understand what's going on. Maybe, or at least the context of what's going on.
I'm also trying to think back to, if you think like thinking back to when you first like got into watching cycling, I guess you were more compelled by the characters and the stories rather than the rules. But I think it is important to have that context. And there was an interview with the director of the series who said in everything, like he says in everything he makes, like all the movies and whatever, it's always about the characters, and that when they handed the show over to the editors to like actually chop it all together, they were from non-cycling backgrounds, so they were treating it very much as like a traditional docuseries, I guess.
And you have to make a decision. You can't have everyone who played a part in those first stages play a role. I mean, Magnus Cort is a character, from what I can understand. And he was in the polka dot jersey on his solo rampage on stage 3 in Denmark. But is his story as good as Jakobsen's comeback? No.
Yeah, no, it's not.
So you have to make that decision. So maybe in a different world, we would have got that story, but you have to, like say, editing.
I also wonder whether we're going to get a bit more of the actual racing kind of dynamic in future stages, right? I don't know how you avoid it in the Roubaix cobble stage. I don't know how you avoid it in the Glandon Galibier stage. Like, how do you avoid talking about the way that these things work in that stage? I mean, maybe they'll find a way, but I have to imagine that, once you get kind of past these initial storylines, I bet we get a bit more. But again, I put money on it, and I haven't watched the whole series yet. I would put money on the polka dot jersey hardly making a cameo, because last year in particular didn't have a great story associated with it.
Yeah,
they want to hook people before they explain things.
Yeah.
So I disagree. I think maybe we will get some explanation of the jerseys, but I think for this first episode, they just need people to want to keep watching. And that's all they care about. And
Jakobsen has a really compelling story.
Oh man, his story is actually amazing when you've got, a 4-minute, when you've compressed like 2 years into 4 minutes, and the crash, and then him coming back from the crash and explaining all of his injuries, and then him winning. It's actually wild because we know, because we saw his comeback over a long period of time. We've also seen other riders who are as injured as Jakobsen not come back to their best. And if you think about Froome compared to Jakobsen, it's insane that he was able, after all of that, to come back and win a stage of the Tour. And I think for that being the first episode and highlighting that, it'll bring people, it'll pull people in. It'll make people want to root for Jakobsen. They'll want to see if he's racing the Tour de France in 2023. They're going to follow his career after they've seen this comeback of his. And so I think from the view of somebody who doesn't know anything about what the polka dot jersey is, this was the perfect first episode.
Yeah, he also comes across really well on camera, Jakobsen.
Yeah,
he doesn't seem to be
got a good
faking
personality.
it or anything.
Yeah, he's a good speaker.
I wonder, and we can talk about this more when we get through more of these episodes, but I wonder who are the characters that come out of this that potentially see a pretty large personal bump in their own following, right? That will be interesting to watch. I mean, even like Bissiger, he's not a name that floats across my mind all that often when it comes to professional bike racing. He's a very, very good rider, but he doesn't come up that much. But he's a bit of the star, even in kind of a tragic way, of this first episode. You have to imagine that his Instagram is an interesting place to be today. If you're just coming into the sport, you don't know that he's not Julian Alaphilippe for all you know, right? Like, why else would they be focusing on this first episode? So I'll be interested to see sort of who the winners are at the end of 8 of them.
I feel like we should also mention that there are multiple teams that were approached that said no.
Yep.
Mess Peterson probably would have been a way more interesting character to introduce in this first episode, with being Danish and a former world champion going for that first yellow jersey. That's a story that I think I would rather see than Bissinger's, but Trek said no, UAE said no. There were multiple teams that didn't like the way that the edit was going to, maybe were worried about the edit or had no say in the edit. And so UAE, they said the executive producer said in that interview that Johnny mentioned that the UAE wanted to be treated a certain way, and they weren't going to treat teams differently. So they said they didn't want to include him in the show, or Tadej Pogacar or UAE. And I think multiple teams had that fear. And so they're also working with what they've got, and they've got this great storyline with Bissinger that goes well with other storylines they want to tell. So yeah.
It's going to be really interesting how they treat Pogacar. I think he's going to be this kind of weird Darth Vader figure off in the edges, where he just doesn't say much. He's just kind of this weird bad guy, because we've got Jumbo-Visma. Exactly. They're in the Jumbo bus, right? And so they've got the other side of the story. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's a massive miss for UAE and Pogacar. Pogacar is a fantastic character. The fact that we're not going to get him in this is a huge bummer. And it's a bummer for him. Like, I genuinely think if I was him, I would be raging mad at my publicist and my team, because this was an opportunity for him to break out of professional cycling and potentially make himself significantly more valuable than he is today. I'd be really pissed off at my team at that decision. And you would have every right to be. It's a shame that we're not going to get him, though. And we are going to get the other side, and I think it's going to be interesting how he's treated, how he's shown, like, how is he characterized? What's the music that runs underneath him, right? Like, all these things are going to be fun to watch over the next 7 episodes, because they have to address him. He's kind of like the second most important person in the entire.
He's
bike
the
race.
antagonist of the whole thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But ironically, like, he's not an antagonist in real life. That's what makes it so interesting.
I think overall, though, it could have been so much worse. Like, we could have been sitting here trying to enjoy a show that we've been excited about for so long and having to really force it. Like, I think always your expectations are going to be so high that it's going to be hard to match them. But when you take a step back, it was pretty good, and it didn't do the thing that often, like, mainstream thing, like, places do when they cover cycling, is just get things completely wrong. Like, It felt a vast percentage of it felt quite true to how you remember the tour and what it was like.
I think the cool kid hipster view of this series is going to be to dislike it, particularly from within the cycling world, right? Like, we liked cycling before Netflix found it. I think that's probably going to be generally the sentiment that we see from a lot of our colleagues. But I genuinely enjoyed this first episode. Do I wish it was more tailored for me and the fact that I've been covering the sport for 12 years or whatever else? Yeah, that would have been fun. Like, more insight would have been great. We didn't get that much kind of behind the scenes stuff from this first episode. I wonder if we'll get more later. But it was it was a good lead, right? It was a good way to grab an audience, I think, and hopefully retain them through 7 more episodes. Let's cut this episode off here. Up next, episode 2, is the return to France and the cobbles of Paris-Roubaix, which are, if you've never seen Paris-Roubaix before, and I assume there's some folks out there who are brand new to all this stuff, really nasty roads full of rocks, basically. And the stage in question, stage 5 of that Tour de France, was absolutely chaotic, and I am looking forward to the episode. So we will be back as soon as we can record another episode, watch it and record another episode. As I mentioned in the trailer, you can either get this podcast on the Unchained Binge Podcast channel, meaning you can search Unchained Binge on whatever podcast thing you use, or if you're already a subscriber to the Escape Collective podcast network, you can just get it there. But it will roll out a bit slower on the main Escape Collective channel. We're going to probably do 2 a week there. We will be posting these basically as soon as we finish them on the Unchained Binge channel. And with that, thanks, Abby.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kit. People can't see you nod.
Oh, yeah. Not used to give bid farewell at the end of these.
Thanks, Johnny.
Thanks. We didn't win the tour there, but I also don't think we lost it there. So
Wait.
We're good to go.
We'll see y'all with episode 2. Bye-bye. Hey, Kaylee Fretz from Escape Collective here. If you've landed on this podcast because you just watched Unchained on Netflix and you want to dive headfirst into the Tour de France and pro bike racing, I have some great news for you. The crew behind this podcast cover pro cycling in depth 365 days a year over at escapecollective.com. We're member funded, meaning listeners and readers support what we do. So if you love this pod, head over to escapecollective.com/join to sign up. You get all kinds of extra stuff. You get past the paywall. You get the best bike content anywhere. Thanks.